The great baking swap, yeast for baking powder.
Hello, fellow bakers. Today, we're tackling an interesting question that many home bakers encounter. What is the ratio of yeast to baking powder for substitution in baking? Understanding this ratio can come in handy when you're out of one ingredient or just exploring different textures and tastes.
Understanding yeast in baking powder.
Before diving into the substitution ratio, let's briefly discuss what these two leavening agents are and how they work. Yeast is a living organism that produces carbon dioxide gas when it consumes sugar. This gas helps dough to rise, resulting in the fluffy and light texture we love in baked goods like bread. Baking powder, on the other hand, is a chemical leavening agent that also produces carbon dioxide gas, but it does so through a chemical reaction when it's mixed with liquid and heated. This is why we use baking powder in recipes like cakes and biscuits, where a quick rise is needed.
Substituting yeast for baking powder.
If you're substituting yeast for baking powder, you're going to need more yeast than baking powder. As a general rule of thumb, for each teaspoon of baking powder, you'd use 1 packet of yeast, which is about 2¼ teaspoons. But remember, yeast needs time to work, so you'll need to allow extra rising time in your recipe.
Substituting baking powder for yeast.
When substituting baking powder for yeast, things get a little tricky because the leavening power of baking powder is stronger than that of yeast. So, you'll need less baking powder. A good starting point is to substitute 1 teaspoon of baking powder for every packet or 2¼ teaspoons of yeast. However, since baking powder doesn't need time to rise like yeast does, you can skip any rise times your recipe calls for. Remember, while these substitutions can save your recipe in a pinch, they won't always give you the exact same result. Baking with yeast versus baking powder can lead to different textures and flavors, which could affect the outcome of your recipe. But with this knowledge in hand, you're well equipped to experiment and find what works best for you. Happy baking!